Tips with Tony. Tips with Tony. All about nutrition from your favorite dietitian. Everything you need to digest in your mind. Tips with Tony. Tips with Tony. Making you healthier one bite at a time. With Tony. Woo!
Before we get into today's episode, I have to tell you about Daily Harvest. If you are not aware about Daily Harvest, listen up. Daily Harvest makes it super easy for you to add fruits and vegetables to your day. As you know, I am one to promote a fruit or a vegetable at most meals because it's going to make you feel good and it's going to give you the nutrients that you need. Now, sometimes adding fruits and vegetables can be easy, but there's other times we don't feel like washing, cutting, prepping, chopping, cooking, all the things. So it's really super convenient when you have this stuff in your freezer that also tastes good. The best part about Daily Harvest is not only do they use a variety of fruits and vegetables, they also include some sort of a unique ingredient that, to be honest, I'm not usually one to purchase or buy just because they're kind of hard to find or the price point's too high. So it's really great that amongst these fruits and vegetables, they have other really cool nutrient dense ingredients that maybe I wouldn't be, keen to try on my own, but it tastes really good inside of these products. So with that said, they have smoothies, harvest bowls, flatbreads, soups, and more. I have not tried something yet that I did not like. They're super convenient. You can leave them in your freezer. They don't go bad. They're super fresh, super delicious. And like I said, a super easy way. Did I say super a lot? A super easy way for you to get in the nutrients, the flavors, and all of the balanced items that you need. So if you have not tried Daily Harvest yet, make sure you go to the link in my show notes or just go to dailyharvest.com and put in Tips with Tony at checkout for $40 off your first box of Daily Harvest. So go to the link in the show notes, use Tips with Tony at checkout for $40 off your first box. Enjoy! Hello and welcome to the Tips with Tony podcast. I'm Tony Marinucci, your registered dietitian, helping you get healthy one bite at a time. I'm very excited for our next guest. I have Andrea virtually in front of me. She is a functional medicine nutritionist and founder of the Functional Nutrition Alliance, where we today are going to be speaking about autoimmune diseases and conditions, myths and truths. And I'm really excited to get into this because I definitely think autoimmune diseases are a little bit more prevalent. I don't know if it's because testing is there. Maybe you can answer that. But anyways, I'm super excited to get into today's episode. So Andrea, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Tony. I'm excited to be here with you.
You're so welcome. First question. It's already, most of the listeners know what it is. It's 3 parts. Introduce yourself, please, by sharing who you are, what you do, and most importantly, why you do what you do.
Good one. Okay, so I'm Andrea Nakayama. I'm a functional medicine nutritionist and founder of the Functional Nutrition Alliance, as you noted, where we see clients virtually, but we also train thousands of practitioners from around the globe in the science and art of the functional nutrition practice. I'm also shifting my attention back to the patient in my work over at AndreaNakayama.com, less so as a clinician and more so in the way we think of ourselves as patients, because I think we've lost our way as patients. And the big driving force for me to do all of this work, to become a functional medicine nutritionist, to found the 2 companies that I founded was my husband's diagnosis and subsequent death from a very aggressive brain tumor. He was diagnosed back in April of 2000 when I was 7 weeks pregnant with our one and only child. And he was given about 6 months to live. He ultimately lived almost 2.5 years. And what that time period was like for me, I mean, we can imagine it was stressful on many levels, but it also was the first time we were acutely in contact with our medical system. And I was able to see the many benefits of our medical system, certainly brain surgery and chemotherapy and radiation, the things we never want to have happen, but they served. But I also saw the many deficiencies with our current medical system. I saw Isamu treated like his diagnosis and not like the man he was. And I saw that they didn't think as globally or holistically about care. It was like the scalpel as opposed to the entire person and how we shift what's happening internally. And that really was the impetus for me to leave a lucrative and well-established career and completely remake myself and my career and my passion.
Wow. So that's a very powerful story. I'm sorry for your loss. And, you know, I always find it, you know, really special and fascinating when I feel like every entrepreneur that I speak to has turned their pain into their purpose. And we actually just had a guest recently about this a few months ago. And it's just special because, you know, there's nothing good that comes out of a loss, especially of a loved one. But if you're going to make something out of it, otherwise it can't be for nothing, right? Like, so the fact that now you're helping, it's probably at this point, you know, thousands of people over the years really, you know, get heard. Because I think a lot of what you probably experienced in the medical field is just sometimes we might be speaking up about like our symptoms or what's going on, but because they're just trying to check the box or just whatever it is, like they might not really be being listened to. So it sounds like you've taken that experience and are now really being the voice and the ears and all the things for people that are really struggling to figure out what's going on with them. Because I know you specialize in autoimmune, and that can be like, I feel like there's so many things that get lumped into that, and the symptoms are so similar, and it's probably so hard to diagnose. And then there's so much misinformation of how you treat it. So thank you for what you do.
Yeah, thank you. And for me, it's really important that we recognize the gaps in healthcare and that we're able to fill them. So my goal, my purpose is to train an army of people who can fill that gap. Because as you're saying, Tony, as patients, we're often stuck in the weeds. What does this mean? What does that mean? Is it this? Should I take that supplement? There's so much noise. Mm-hmm. Should I follow that diet? Is this going to be the answer? And it's hard to really figure out what to do between doctors' visits in our everyday care. And that's where people like you and people like those I train are really there to support that in-between space and act as a translator for what's going on in the body, which can be really confusing, especially when it's autoimmune in nature.
Definitely. And I also like that you gave credit and you acknowledged that not everything in healthcare is terrible, because I think unfortunately there are some functional medicine doctors or functional medicine nutritionists that tend to think it's like one way or the other. But I love that you mentioned about filling the gaps and working with what's working and then, you know, figuring out and sorting out what's not. And it can be complementary, right? It doesn't have to be one or the other. So I think that's
I call it the yes and. Like it has to be a yes and. I'm not here to say that medicine shouldn't happen. Right. And I'm not here to pretend that I can be a doctor. I'm not.
Right.
But
definitely.
They should, as you're saying, be complementary.
Definitely. I love that. Awesome. Okay. So now I could be making assumptions, but I feel like, do you have Hashimoto's yourself? Is that why you decided to go in? Okay. So tell us a little bit more about that. Like what has your journey been? When were you diagnosed? Go ahead.
So as we'll talk about, there are many factors that lead to an autoimmune condition. It's never one thing. And I know we'll look at myths, but that is one myth, that it's because of one reason. And when I think back about my autoimmune journey, it was certainly triggered by a number of factors. Pregnancy itself is a trigger for autoimmunity, one possible trigger, because there's so much changing immunologically and hormonally in our bodies at one time. So when we think about it, I was going through all of that while experiencing the stress of my husband basically being given a death sentence. So you can put that regular stress of pregnancy, which some of us handle just, beautifully, on steroids. in terms of what was happening in my body. And I do feel like I handled it fairly well. We were in it together, and it was a really beautiful time, even though it was a really daunting time. But it took several years after the baby was born, our son was born, who's now in his 20s, after Isamu, my late husband, passed away, for me to recognize that something wasn't right in my body. It wasn't responding the way it had previously responded. Things were happening with feeling like kind of inflamed. I couldn't get anybody to pay attention to what was going on for me because I didn't look like I had a thyroid issue. I wasn't overweight in any way, which used to be the old school way of thinking about thyroid. People were assuming that I was seeing, and I live in Portland, Oregon, so I live in naturopathic world, and the diagnosis du jour was adrenal issues. And so because of my experience, that kept being put on me as that was the issue. And so I was being treated as if I had an adrenal issue, which I did not have. And it took years for me to do my own research and ultimately being in the field myself and working with my mom's thyroid issues for me to recognize, wait a minute, this is what's happening for me. And then finding a doctor who could validate, because it's not in my scope to diagnose, but for a doctor to validate what I already knew. So it's almost hard for me to say, like, when was I diagnosed? Because I was unearthing that diagnosis on my own and putting the pieces together. But it took years. And this is what I hear from many people, particularly women, that it can take 4 doctors, 3 years, or flip that. But it takes a long time because there's no one easy diagnosis for autoimmunity. Most autoimmune conditions, thyroid is actually a little easier. But it can take a long time, and it takes time to be heard that your symptoms aren't something that can be easily addressed.
Yeah. Well, and then like the symptoms, I think that's the hardest thing, right? Because I mean, I could be wrong, but I mean, from what I've heard and from people I've worked with certain conditions, like the symptoms, they all mask each other. You can, right? Like let's talk about some of the symptoms for Hashimoto's, and like, are there similars and differences for other autoimmune conditions? Because I think it's important to talk about it. I don't want people to, like, you know, if they're listening to this, if they tuned on, you know, they might suspect that they might have an autoimmune condition. So I also want to just put a disclaimer out there that, like, please, we can't even diagnose you. You do need to go to a doctor, but what we will talk about, like, what to ask your doctor, what to say, what to check for, so that you can go in a little bit more informed. But this is not to diagnose yourself, but to, you know, bring yourself awareness too, that, you know, if you feel something, say something.
Yes, absolutely. And I hope we can get into how, from a patient perspective, we can help ourselves even while we're looking for a diagnosis. Definitely. Because what happens is we think the diagnosis is going to be the cure. And that's where we get in a trap, because even with an autoimmune diagnosis, it isn't the be all end all. Once you have that, there isn't an easy answer. And I see so many people go through that cycle of just waiting to be heard, waiting to find out, then receiving that diagnosis, celebrating like, oh my God, I'm not crazy. Yeah. But then there's no one easy fix for a diagnosis like autoimmunity. And that's because where our medical system, just to go back to that issue before we get to symptoms, our medical system excels at acute care. Autoimmune conditions, like any chronic or niggling sign and symptom that isn't resolved, is a chronic issue. And we have to address that differently. And that's where we have to fill the gaps. Yeah. And so we're sometimes looking in the wrong places for the wrong information. And our medical system doesn't have the answers for autoimmunity. So symptoms of thyroid issues can be, as you're saying, Tony, vast. They can be weight gain, inflammation, brain fog, hair loss, skin irritations, everything. I have a matrix, right? The functional nutrition matrix. It can fall everywhere on that matrix. GI issues, the thyroid is there's cells that are receptive to thyroid hormone throughout the entire body. And so that means it can manifest throughout the body. So some people will have GI issues. Some people will have weight loss. Some people will have weight gain. Some people will have fluctuation. There could be constipation, diarrhea, brain fog, all of the things, insomnia can occur. And it's hard to pinpoint that on, oh, it's the thyroid or it's Hashimoto's. Because like you're saying, could be another hormonal imbalance, could be another autoimmune condition, could be a GI dysfunction.
Right. Yeah. I mean, everything you just listed could be a bazillion things, even within it, even like GI issues. There's so many different GI diagnoses that we could that it could be. So I think considering like most of the people who listen to this podcast, they definitely come from a all or nothing mentality, in there when they're dieting, they're quote unquote eating super quote unquote clean and perfect. And I'm lots of air quotes, guys, totally. Cutting out carbs, like blah, blah, blah. But then they might be on the other end where they're not eating any vegetables or they're binging or maybe they're in the middle, but it's like super like hyper fixation on like perfect plates and they're restricted and rigid, not on purpose, but just because they think that's how they have to be in order to maintain their weight or whatever it is. So my question with that is, because I feel like a very rigid, restrictive diet or someone in that all or nothing mentality often can experience a lot of those symptoms as well.
Totally.
And like, I don't know, is it like, can that like make it the autoimmune kind of more present? Does it make it go away? Like, I would love for you to speak to, as a functional medicine nutritionist, like how nutrition plays a role. And because I think when people hear like autoimmune, they think of like cutting out gluten, cutting out dairy, quote unquote, eating healthier, but only whole foods. And like, so I just want you to kind of speak to how nutrition plays a role in helping autoimmune diseases and how it can hurt autoimmune diseases.
Yeah. So that's such a big question.
I know it's a big question.
It's a great question. I mean, it's really where my present work is focused on. How do we recognize all the places where resistance to doing something or not doing something is actually impacting our physiological terrain as well? So my mantra for all the work I do is everything is connected, we are all unique, and all things matter. And sometimes when we have these relationships with food, although I do believe nutrition plays a role, nutrition might not be the thing we can address right now. And so when I think about autoimmunity and any chronic condition, so whether it's autoimmune or you're experiencing signs and symptoms that won't go away, let's just call it chronic because you've tried the things and it hasn't resolved and you're frustrated. I always look at it through what I call 3 roots, many branches. And I'm going to share this model because it's a way for us to rethink the nutrition component. So any sign, symptom, or diagnosis that you and I could identify, and we could throw them out, Tony, the things you hear about the most, whether they're the things I just shared that are related to Hashimoto's or anxiety, depression, migraines, restless leg, PCOS, anything, fibromyalgia, anything, that is a branch on the tree, according to this model. So we have 3 roots, many branches. Any sign, symptom, or diagnosis you can write down in this moment is a branch. Our system and the way we think targets the branch. We think if I target that symptom or that diagnosis, which is a scalpel approach, I'm going to be better. But that isn't the case. So we have to think deeper, come down to the trunk of that tree, come down to the roots of that tree. There are always 3 roots when we have chronic conditions, but I want us to go into the soil that those roots live in. So those 3 roots are the genes, digestion, and inflammation. And the genes are our genetic predisposition. It's not that you control your genes. So it's a good example of a root and soil. We can influence our genetic expression, and we influence our genetic expression. That's a realm of science called epigenetics with our food, our movement, our environment, and our mindset. If food isn't healthy to think about for you right now, and by healthy, I mean it triggers you into behaviors or thought patterns that cause more anxiety, then that's not where we focus on this moment. There's other ways we can get in. I do believe food has a place, but it has a place and a time as well. So I'd rather focus on digestion, which is our second route, because we can't talk about food without talking about where food meets physiology. And this is what makes it functional. We have to talk about that symbiosis. So if anybody's talking about nutrition or food or autoimmune paleo or keto or intermittent fasting, without discussing what that means in your body, then we're missing the whole benefit of nutrition. So I'd rather bring people into the parasympathetic state, the rest and digest, and focus on optimizing and tuning in to how we feel when we eat, optimizing the function of digestion, and really focusing on like mindset, which has a lot of components to it in terms of the stress that we could be under when we're eating. And there's a lot of stories we tell ourselves about food that I think can be part of the healing process, in addition to what we eat, what we don't eat, when we eat. I think of it as quality, quantity, diversity, and timing. All of those things matter, and we might be making tiny tweaks if food isn't your friend to be shifting in this moment.
Right. Oh, it was really powerful. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think it's really important to highlight that, because if you're stressing about what to eat, when to eat, how much to eat, it's probably causing you more harm than good. It's affecting your digestion. It's taking you out of that parasympathetic state, and it's making it hard for you to absorb any of the nutrients that you're consuming anyway. So a couple things. I definitely want to talk about inflammation, but since we talked about mindset and stress, which I guess that's also correlated, but before I even get into that, have you, what is your experience with like emotional trauma? Because you often will hear that, you know, someone a lot of times, like when they're going through, and you were going through a very emotional time, so that's when it kind of came out. So would you think, would healing the trauma be one of those routes? Or
So
is that part of the grant? Like, where does that go?
It's definitely part of the trunk, right? So we have to address those factors. That's not my job. That's not my scope, but it is my scope to recognize it. So when I said everything is connected, that's where I come into the physiological function. The gut's connected to the brain. The hormones are connected to the gut, to the liver. It's recognizing systems biology. We are all unique is where I really think we have more opportunity to dive in. To your point, Tony, these are triggers that have led to the conglomeration of factors that actually manifest in those branches. So yes, I have to deal with my trauma and look at it and be recognizing where it lives within me. That's adult trauma. People have trauma throughout their childhood. We have trauma in relation to food and dieting and our bodies and our body image. And so for me, the opportunity to sink into that, not with the purpose of like fixing it, but of recognizing, this is corny, but I always like to say, I think of it as the oh me versus the why me, because when we're in that why me state, why is this happening to me? Why does this work for my sister or my neighbor or my mother and not me? Then we're in this place of resistance that doesn't actually acknowledge, yeah, that happened to me. And here are the scars I live with from this experience. And I'm still moving forward, but I recognize that that's a part of me. So for me, the way I'm talking about this could and should be a trauma-informed way of working, even though it's not the modality that actually addresses the trauma. It recognizes that is part of who you are. And I hold and honor that that's going to come up as we're working together.
Right. Definitely. Definitely. Okay. So switching gears to, because you mentioned inflammation, and there's a lot of misconceptions I feel about inflammation. So I would love for you to share, I guess maybe I feel like I've described this before, but maybe you have actually, I really love the way you have been describing things so far. So maybe if people hear it from you in a different way, just explain what inflammation is and why it is a root that we want to get to the bottom of in order to, manage the autoimmune condition better.
Yeah. And I just want to remind us to think in the soil. Like we tend to, as a culture, think about the roots. Like I need to find the root. She's talking about digestion, I need a stool analysis to tell me what's wrong with that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying there are ways we could chew better. There are ways we can look to optimize how we're bringing in and digesting and utilizing our food. So the circle of influence that are the soil around the roots for inflammation are clear, calm, enhance, and modulate. Because the immune system is very, very complex, and inflammation is a biological response that is appropriate. We want to experience inflammation when we stub our toe, when we get a splinter, when we get an infection. Those are places where we want inflammation working for us. In a chronic situation like autoimmunity, the inflammation has gotten turned on and it's not gotten turned off. And so we have to get curious about what's keeping the immune system and the cells in the blood in that hypervigilant state. Because what's happened with autoimmunity is those immune cells have turned on, not turned off, and they are also attacking tissues in your own body. So they're hypervigilant. I like to say they're in like a kind of a state, and they're running around and they haven't figured out what to do. And so they're attacking tissues in your own body. So with Hashimoto's, attacking tissues in my thyroid gland. So that's where we need to clear and calm. What we need to clear and calm is going to be unique for each and every one of us. Might we need to clear a food that is causing a reaction for you? In this situation, we might need to do that at the appropriate time with some help. It might be hard to figure that out on your own and in a way that's not triggering. Might we need to clear some electronics from your bedroom at nighttime? Might we need to clear an infection of some sort? So that clearing is going to be different for every single individual and is very vast. Might we need to clear a toxic relationship in your life that's causing you to be in a hyper stress response? So if we move to calm, that's where we can really direct some of our own personal attention. Where am I noticing I'm overreactive? How do I tune in to where I'm triggered? I had a situation yesterday. There's somebody who's been working on my house and he hadn't contacted me for 2 months and then contacted me to say, like, somebody's showing up tomorrow to start painting your house. And I'm like, wait, what? And I noticed my entire nervous system, which is a phrase I feel like we use kind of ubiquitously these days. But I felt like I was kind of like in this fluttered up state of discomfort and panic and something not being right at a very subtle level. But me recognizing that helps me to calm myself down, hold that experience and my reaction to it, recognize that it's likely not about that one thing. Like there's a number of things that are leading up to that response. But I feel like calm with our nervous system coming into that rest and digest instead of the fight or flight, and being in that parasympathetic state can help us to pay more attention so that we can better represent ourselves for ourselves, but also with the people we're seeking help from. So that's how I think about the immune response. It's going to be triggered by all the things, not just the one thing that we're eating or an infection. It's all the things.
Yeah. Yeah. Because I think, it makes sense, right? If you don't feel good, you want to go into fix it mode and you want to fix it quickly and you want to fix it aggressively and you don't want to feel this way and you want to get to the bottom of it. And but it's like that anxious sort of feeling is probably what's making things a lot worse. And then I was probably the extremes, right? I feel like, I'd be doing the listeners a disservice if we didn't talk about maybe certain foods that you hear can be inflammatory, and kind of what you do with your patients in helping them to, do you cut it out? How much do you consume? Does it build up? I even hate speaking it out loud because it's just I feel like, it just almost will validate what people are thinking, but not trying to validate that these things are things that we should be demonizing right away. But I'm just going to talk about them. So I think we should talk about sugar and how it plays in autoimmune. I think we should talk about oils because that's a big one, right? Especially in TikTok right now. And I think we should talk about probably wheat, gluten / dairy.
Yep.
Maybe soy. I don't know. How much time do you have?
I know. There's we could go there's
so many misconceptions and myths out there. But and tell me if I'm wrong. This is not my specialty. But I feel like obviously anything in excess, especially if it's attacking your body, is never going to be something we want to be consuming. If you notice it's not making you feel good. I don't have celiac disease, but I don't eat gluten because it makes me feel like absolute garbage. And that's a personal preference and a personal choice. So I would never judge someone if they take something out and it feels good. But I just think where a lot of people get stuck is they take out all of these things. They might do something like Whole30, and try to self-diagnose and then feel guilty if they eat a little bit of it and then they overdo it. And so I would love for you to speak to kind of those 5 foods.
You talk generally for a moment,
okay.
Again, just to kind of reframe it. Because it used to be early in my career that there were non-negotiable foods that had to come out. And that's really shifted for me as I work with and recognize people have these challenges around food in their body and these all or nothing behaviors. And I just want to honor those attempts first and foremost. We do want to feel better. Right. And that's so important. And the mindset shift really comes from recognizing we don't need to fix you because you're not broken. Your body is actually more functional than it's not. One of the things I do with people when we're looking at their labs is highlight everything that looks great, which is way more than what doesn't. And that's not usually how we look at things. We tend to look at what isn't working, and a functional lens is different than a pathological lens, but people get worried about that. So my frame now is to shift into 3 primary principles around food that are about inclusion before we even talk about exclusion. So principle number 1 is eat fat, fiber, and protein at every single meal. And the reason why I have people anchor on fat, fiber, and protein is because my non-negotiable trifecta for finally feeling better includes sleep, poop, and blood sugar balance. And so I'm not having people measure their blood sugar or worry about their carbs. I'm just saying, eat fat, fiber, or protein. What are your questions? What do you need to include? How do you need to think about that? So every time you eat, you're even thinking about that. Even if you're eating something you thought you quote unquote shouldn't be eating, how can you sprinkle some nuts on top or do whatever it is that you need to think about to play with that mantra?
And I just want to add, because, if you're listening to the podcast a bazillion times, one of the things that we encourage at Tips with Tony, and it's not different from most dietitians or registered dietitians or nutritionists, which is a carbohydrate, a protein, a fat, and a fruit or vegetable. You're basically saying, she's saying the same thing. So you don't have to go crazy. We're just talking about if that carbohydrate or fruit or a complex carbohydrate and a fruit or vegetable is going to have fiber, and then that protein and that fat, that's going to keep it balanced. Which we talk about the same things, but I just want so people don't think that which one do I do? We're saying the same thing.
Yeah. Foundational. I think that is where we need to come back to. I call it the simplicity on the other side of complexity. We're often making things really complex. Fat, fiber, protein, like you said, fiber comes in through our fruits and vegetables. That's awesome. The next principle I like to invite people to play with is eating the rainbow. Again, really simple, have fun. Think about rainbow foods that come from the ground up and play. What are you including? What are you excluding? What could you use more of color-wise in your day-to-day? And just have fun with it. That's another area. The third area becomes a little bit more personalized. And this is like what you said, Tony. You notice that personally, you don't eat gluten because it doesn't make you feel good. My son, who's 22, doesn't eat gluten, not because he has celiac, but he notices it makes him really tired and he doesn't want to be tired. So he's tuned in to know, you know what, if I have a little on occasion, like there's a crouton in my salad, no biggie. But if I ate a pizza or a bun, I'm falling asleep and not able to partake. So he's just like, no, thank you. And he has that balance. We've lost that balance. So what I really like people to tune into is, what do I know works for me and what do I think doesn't? And to maybe create a yes, no, and maybe list. If your no list is really, really long and your maybe list is really confused, that's a place to ask for help, because you can't tell anymore what's working and what doesn't. So I wanted to set that stage before I talk.
That was wonderful. Yes, definitely. I really appreciate that. That is very helpful.
So when we think about these quote unquote inflammatory foods, everything is true but partial. So we have to recognize that foods that are more processed through our chemical interventions in the food system can be inflammatory in the right system for that inflammation to occur. In my system, which has an autoimmune condition, which lives with a lot of stress, running a big business, those foods are felt. I feel that inflammation, and I don't want to feel that inflammation because I have a purpose that I want to live into. So those foods are inflammatory for a number of reasons, and this includes the refined sugars, the processed sugars, and the refined fats that take more in a factory for them to come out as something we ingest in our bodies. And the truth is, there are some cultures and countries that don't even allow the chemical processing that we do here in the States with things that we call food. So for me personally, as you said, those are things I know to be inflammatory and are particularly inflammatory in my system. So I don't feel like, yay, I'm eating it and I can, when I know it's actually keeping me from being my best self. But that is a journey that I had to get to. Those foods cause more oxidative stress, more free radical damage, which is more work for our immune system to do. If it's already overzealous, we're feeding that fire. That's just a truth. Not to vilify the food, but to recognize there is a place where food meets physiology. And if it's something you're struggling with, we honor that. We don't talk about it yet. We work with other tactics, and then we get there when we need to, based on your condition.
Yeah. And then also, is there some truth to the saying, like, the damage is in the dose? Like, and I think that's kind of like, so I think for you, obviously for you, same thing with me and gluten. Like, I just don't have it because, like, why, when I know it, for me, it does kind of build. And I'm like, well, why even like give it a chance to build? But there might be like certain things that I think it's important that, you know, when you're hearing this, that how much you can tolerate versus how much you can't might be different based on your physiology.
Exactly. So this takes us from the dose makes the poison conversation, which is about the external factor, to that symbiosis where it's about your body. This is like, for me, nutrition often ends up in the realm of like, coffee, is it bad or good?
Yeah.
Wine, is it bad or good? And I'm like, like that conversation.
Need context.
It's like, it's not interesting. So those two quote unquote food categories: refined sugars, which can impact our blood sugar and our hormones and everything from there. Refined oils, which are chemicals, they do have an impact on the internal terrain, depending on what that internal terrain is. So,
yeah. And would you say, is there a difference versus like, just, dousing, refined, let's say sweetened beverages, right? Versus like having a, I don't know, oh God, I'm afraid to like say certain foods. White rice.
Oh,
white rice,
sure.
with chicken and avocado and beef. You know what I mean? Like, it's also, you have to remember when we talk about that pairing that we were talking about before, our body digests it differently when it's consumed in a balanced way versus just kind of consumed on its own. And I think that's important to hear as well.
1,000%. I'm talking about refined sugars, like you said, in a sugar-laden drink, or, even if we're making a cake or a pie or a muffin or a cookie, and we're caring about those ingredients and we can tolerate those sugars, great. My body can't. Mm-hmm. So I want people to tune into what I think of as the path, the bike lane, and the poison ivy. That comes back to that yes, no, maybe list, right? So for me, and I call it a bike lane because I live on the West Coast, but it could be called the shoulder on the East Coast, the shoulder of the road, right?
Yeah.
We don't drive in the shoulder, but sometimes we have to go into the shoulder for a reason of our choosing. It might be to turn, it might be to dodge something, right? So I have my poison ivy foods. I just don't eat them because they don't serve me and I don't need to, and I don't miss them, and I'm fine. Like, not a trigger not to eat them. I have my bike lane foods like chips. I like chips. I want to eat potato chips sometimes. Fine, but they're not something I'm going to eat a lot of because they don't actually make me feel great.
Right.
And then I have my pack, which I make sure is wide enough for me to be sated, to enjoy my food, to delight in my food, to love nourishing myself, and really just love flavor. Like, we have to all find that. And if we're not there, again, that might be where we need help in identifying what's happening underneath. So then, of course, we could talk about all those other foods like gluten and dairy and soy, which are thought of as top inflammatory foods. And once again, in the right, quote unquote, right circumstances, they can be. And there are a lot of associations between those three food categories and an overactive immune system because of the form and function and health of the digestive system. So once again, I'm going back to, if we're talking about food, let's optimize where food is coming in versus vilifying the food. There still might be things that are best left off the table when you are physiologically and psychologically ready to go there. I'll give you a quick example. My boyfriend, when I met him 5 years ago, could only eat chicken, white rice, and oatmeal. Like, he couldn't eat other foods. And I was like, why can't you eat foods? Slowly, he started to speak to me about what would happen. And I realized, like, oh, there's an issue with his digestion. And I made simple changes of things he could do easily, put in his smoothie, change the way he was eating his oatmeal. He can now eat anything, no digestive issues. So it took years and him being diligent, but he can eat anything. That is not true of me, because even though I've done the same work to optimize my digestion, my immune system is different than his. And that's where we have to think differently about each of our journeys and recognize that it's a journey. It is a journey on a number of levels.
Yeah, definitely. And I like that. And it doesn't, no one gets a medal or is a hero if they're able to eat all their foods back versus not. I think it goes back to, like, you are individual, you as an individual, you're going to just do the best that you can. And know what your limits are, and then know where you can. I love the bike lane analogy. Going back to that, that was amazing. That was so great. I love that.
Yeah, it definitely helps to just think about what's true for me. Sometimes I like to sit in the collection of the information before I even do. And I think, like you were saying, Tony, we go into the like, oh, that's the latest thing, I'll try that. But we haven't actually learned about ourselves in relationship to that. So I'm a big fan of tracking as a tool to what am I learning about myself? How do I step back and just collect data without assessing it? Just collect it. And then maybe if you need to get some help, you can show up with better questions. I realize when I eat breakfast, I have more energy than when I don't eat breakfast. I realize when I eat eggs and avocados and spinach, I feel better than when I drink a green smoothie. Like that is information that helps you take care of yourself. Yeah. And one of the things I like to remind people is like, it's yours to take. Like, how do you take it in a way that's appropriate for you?
Yeah. Oh, this is so good. I mean, like normally I try not to keep the episodes too long, but I can keep talking to you because it's really powerful. It's really powerful. And I feel like you're saying things in a way that, I do feel like a little bit lonely in the world as a dietitian of being, I'm not one side or the other. I'm very much in the middle. And because that's not like, viral worthy or TikTok worthy or whatever, it feels, it can get a little lonely, but you've just explained it in such a great way, because that's the thing. Like sometimes we do have conditions where I'm a huge proponent of all foods fit, but you might not want all foods to fit because it doesn't make you feel good. And I think what you're doing is you're really creating a space where you're helping people to understand, like you're helping them to be empowered with what choices they can do and what they have, like what options they have for themselves. And it's really refreshing. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Tony. And I just, to reflect what you're saying about it being lonely, I often feel like my message isn't sexy because it's not. It's boring because it's like, it's no, sorry. Like it's not a quick fix. It's not a quick fix at all. It takes work. That's a trap.
I know. But the other thing I always try to help people to understand is that although our methods do really, they take time because we want them to be their own advocates. We want them to bring the awareness. We want, we want the communication between seeing what's working, what's not, and like trial and error and experimentation like that. Yes, that does take time. However, it is the quicker way. Like it's the much faster way, because otherwise 1000%. You're going to spend years in the unknown, not being clear on what to do, consistently having symptoms, not having symptoms, like kind of just always back at square one. And, we don't want that for you.
Yeah. And I've worked with thousands of people who have been to all the top functional, integrative, holistic doctors, and they're worse for wear because then they're rejecting all the supplements, all the diet, and there was something in it, but it wasn't administered in the right way. And that's where I really get my hands on my hips and feel like we gotta do so. Like this isn't about the one test and the treatment for the test. It's not about the one diet that's going to fix it all, because it works for a small portion of the population, but not all the people we want to help.
Yeah, definitely. Oh my God, this is so good. All right. Before we wrap, is there anything that you want to add that you think would be important for the listeners to hear or to know?
I think we went over many of the important principles. I am going to say, like, if you're able to track, even if you can't track your food, because that can be triggering, track something, track your cycle, track your sleep, track your water, like just start to play with how you learn about what works for you and what doesn't work for you. I'm going to say something about hydration, because there's a lot of symptoms that result from being dehydrated. I can see it in people's serum labs, and they're bypassing that. They're experiencing fatigue or anemia. We got to hydrate. Heart palpitations, we have to hydrate. So just even these things that feel really simple, just take a look. What's your relationship to that? Certainly sleep and poop, again, are non-negotiables for me. So break it down instead of thinking about this one thing is going to fix all the things. Find where you want to focus your attention in one area of your life gather some information, get some help for that, and take it slowly but surely forward, because that thing, whatever you're looking at, is going to impact those branches.
Yeah, definitely. You made me just have to have one more question. So hydration is actually super popular right now, which it's good. I want people to stay hydrated. Like, it's trending, which is good. We want people to drink. So what do people need to be drinking something other than water? Should people be putting something else other than water in their water to be staying hydrated?
Not in my opinion.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah.
I mean, if we have issues with our electrolytes, then that's a different story. But we're making things more complicated than they need to be for reasons that don't necessarily pertain to us. I used to call this, Tony, and I'm quite a bit older than you, but I used to call this the epigenetics of the online telesummit, because back in the day, it's podcast now, but it used to be telesummits. People were coming on giving all sorts of advice that doesn't necessarily make sense for the individual watching. And the watchers, those of us who are patients or clients, were taking supplements, adhering to dietary protocols, putting things in our water on top of our food that weren't necessarily appropriate for our specific needs, just because some influencer told us to do it. And that could actually lead to other imbalances.
Yeah. If you're having too much of one thing, they all affect each other. Our body's trying to keep us in balance, and we're making it really hard for it.
Exactly. So slow the roll.
Yeah.
Just focus on your basics.
Yeah.
And then get help if you need help with addressing a specific imbalance that you're experiencing or you're looking to address. That's a different story than, again, I said this at the beginning, we've lost our way in being patients. We are self-diagnosing, self-prescribing. It is not helping.
Not at all. Yeah. So you need to find good practitioners that you can trust. And I would say, Andrea, this was wonderful. I can tell you do great work. The way you explain things is super, because that's the thing. A lot of people walk out of doctor's offices confused and not even knowing they get a diagnosis. They don't even know what it means. I think you did an excellent job just explaining everything. So I just want to thank you for your time. And if people do want to work with you or get in touch with you, maybe they have follow-up questions, what would be the best way for them to contact you?
So all the Andrea Nakayama, so AndreaNakayama.com, that's a lot of A's. On the web, Andrea Nakayama, so Instagram, LinkedIn, I'm not on Twitter much, Facebook. So all the Andrea Nakayamas, and that will lead you back to all the other places. My podcast, my training program, our clinic, and all of the things I've mentioned.
Great. Okay. So I'm going to make sure I put those in the show notes. I really appreciate you being here. For those listening, make sure you give her a follow. If you have follow-up questions, make sure you ask them. If you're not subscribed to the podcast, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you get notified when a new episode comes out. And as always, thank you so much for being here. And thank you guys so much for listening. As always, this is Tony Marinucci, your registered dietitian, helping you get healthy one bite at a time.